Hello, and welcome to the second workshop, this one on the basics of argumentation theory. So we're covering a number of things in this workshop. The first is a general idea, what are arguments? So just a discussion about what it is that we think is a good way of understanding arguments versus debate. Second, why it is that we break down arguments into different component parts. Then we'll be talking about the basic structure of those arguments, how we impact arguments, how we make them relevant to the debate, and then finally how we do linkage, which is say how we connect up those arguments into the wider debate apparatus. So first, what are arguments? So arguments are devices in speech that are intended to persuade someone to change their view about someone. You can in some ways see this with some of the metaphorical embedding of arguments in our language. We use phrases like someone being swayed by an argument, or someone advancing a position, or there being leaps in logic, which create this idea of movement. This conception of argumentation is arguments moving someone in a particular direction, namely the conclusion, the thing that we're trying to persuade them of, can be contrasted with a different way of understanding arguments, whereby an argument is a kind of binary thing. It's either proven or not proven. If it's not perfectly proven, it doesn't really count for much, and it needs to meet some special standard of proof in order to be totally valid. Now that may be a very appropriate way of thinking about argumentation in something like the formal sciences, or in analytical philosophy, or these kind of things. But it's not necessarily a helpful way to think about arguments for the purpose of persuasive debates. After all, if you're thinking about you engaged in debating against another person, then the question is not, have you met some abstract standard of what it is to prove an argument, but rather have you persuaded the audience better than the other person has, which may involve a certain degree of imperfection in terms of the standards of proof being used, but it might be more helpful to think in terms of the ideal goal of an argument being to move someone in the direction that you want them to go, in terms of the beliefs they have before they heard your argument versus the beliefs they have afterwards. Now, the way that we think about arguments, that is to say that the way that we'll be explaining to you how you should think about arguments, is by breaking down arguments into component elements, into different parts of the wider argument that are supposed to do, to some extent, different things. One reason for this is that arguments are obviously quite complex mechanisms. So if we think of an argument as being effectively a mechanism that we're using to try and persuade someone, as the previous slide said, they're relatively complex in the way they actually operate, and they have to be broken down so the audience can follow along. If we think about what you're likely to find persuasive or unpersuasive, it's unlikely that you'll be persuaded by an argument if you can't follow the different steps in that procedure. It's also helpful when you're thinking about how to actually construct arguments to think about them in this relatively modular way. You can perhaps see where a piece of argumentation, or I guess a few sentences of explanation, put it that way, would be useful in fitting into the overall argument in a particular way as part of the supporting structure of the overall claim being used, in a way that you might not if you just thought of arguments as someone speaking for a minute and trying to persuade someone of their conclusion. It makes sense to break them down into different chunks. So if we think about that structure of arguments, you could say, well, arguments to some extent like a story. They take people from where they are currently in the direction of the conclusion, hopefully all the way to the conclusion. So we have an origin, the premises, the things that you stipulate for the purpose of the arguments. We have a root, that's to say the method of argumentation that you're using, and we have the destination, the conclusion. But in other ways, they're unlike a story, which is to say that the easiest way to stop the audience being confused is to actually start with the ending. We start with the conclusion because we want the audience to know where it is that we're going. We label the argument with our target in mind, the thing that we are hoping to prove, and then we use supporting argumentation, evidence, or warrants to try and persuade them that we've reached our target. So if we think about just breaking down arguments, we're going to look at breaking down arguments into the component parts. If we get these component parts sorted out, it will make our arguments more effective, they'll be easier to follow, they'll be therefore more persuasive for the audience. So we're going to, broadly speaking, break down arguments into four elements. The first is the title. It's literally the claim that you're trying to prove with your argument. The second is what I'm going to call analysis. This is just the supporting argumentation that's in favor of the argument. Some people refer to this as inference. Some people refer to this as supporting argumentation. We're going to call this analysis. Then we have evidence, or what I'm going to term warrant as an alternative way of terming evidence, just because evidence has the same connotation, which is the evidence that we offer in support of our proof. So We'll discuss that in more detail, but it doesn't necessarily have to be things like statistics. It could be things like anecdote and these kind of things. And finally, the impact, the consequences if we prove our claim. It's useful to get into the habit of following these sorts of schemes, of breaking down arguments in this way, because then it becomes habitual. Then if I know that I have the task of proving a particular point, I can say, okay, well, I need to first have my title, then I need to have my evidence, I need to have supporting argumentation around that evidence, I need to finally end with the impact. I need to tell the audience why it's important. If we think first about titles, what do you find it easier to make sense of in a debate about minimum prices for alcohol, say? If someone just says, my first argument is going to be about incentives, or if someone says, my first argument is going to be about how this changes incentives to discourage binge drinking and encourage socially responsible drinking. I put it to you, it's probably the second one, because you know where that argument is now going. You know what the destination they're trying to take you towards is. You know what the overall significance of that argument is, and so you're not going to be confused when they start giving you the overall analysis, right? You're not going to miss any steps within that process. So when you're thinking about labeling arguments, think initially about, okay, where is this argument going? What are we trying to prove? And that should be the first thing used to describe it. Labels are useful in debates in particular because it means you can refer back to the same argument. You know, I can say, as I told you in my first argument about incentives, or alternatively, other people in the same team can refer to that argument. So it's helpful if there's a key word somewhere in there that can be used to facilitate that labeling. But in terms of the audience following along, it should be a clear statement of the thesis that the argument is trying to prove. The next step that we've listed in terms of the breakdown is analysis. So analysis is really just the way that we're further breaking down those claims in a way to try and persuade the audience of them. Analysis could come in the form of reasons why the claim is true, reasons why the claim is important, explanations of evidence that we've used to try and put that evidence in a general context, an explanation of how one claim relates to others in the debate, some comparative analysis between different things. We'll have a workshop specifically on thinking about those comparisons, how to make them later. We won't really be touching on it in this workshop. So, I mean, one way to just think about doing analysis is just asking yourself the question, why? If we get in that habit of forcing ourselves to give more analysis by asking ourselves, why is this the case? Or forcing yourself to answer the question, why is this important? You find that you're forcing yourself to come up with more reasons, more analytical content, more persuasive reasons that the judge or the audience could listen to and be persuaded of the truth of the claim that you're trying to set out to prove. The more independent reasons you give, probably the more persuaded the audience will be. Rhetorical questions maybe provide a means of adding a feeling of engagement and structure, but they can also act as prompts to the speaker themselves to remind them they need to do more analysis. What do I mean by rhetorical questions? Well, I mean questions just like that. I mean things where they're short question-like statements that you are asking yourself as a speaker and then going on to answer. It's a useful device for helping to give the speech a sense of flow, but also a sense of direction, so the audience is better able to follow along with what you're saying. Suppose we have a worked example here, which you can see on the screen behind me. So we're thinking about the death penalty. We have a title for our argument, which is going to be that we will show the death penalty as unacceptable because it results in the state killing innocent people. But then we need to unpack that idea more. Why is that true? So we might have analysis statements. The criminal justice system is designed to minimize wrongful convictions. We could give as an example of that the fact that this is why we have rules of evidence. And we say, for example, to let people know this is an example of the overall thing that we're trying to prove. The death penalty is irreversible. Once the state kills people, it cannot take that back or compensate them. Evidence. We know that organizations like the Innocence Project has been able to overturn hundreds of wrongful convictions. Analysis, explaining why that evidence is significant. We accept that mistakes can be made, but when mistakes are made with the death penalty, the results are terminal. At least, if people are wrongfully convicted with custodial sentences, we can financially compensate those people for the harm done to them. So we've given an explanation of not just that the evidence exists, that there are wrongful convictions in the system, but why that evidence is significant in terms of trying to prove the overall thesis that the death penalty is unacceptable because it results in the state killing innocent people. Analysis, the state should never put itself in a position where it's killing innocent people. This builds upon the analysis we've already given as to why that's a likely consequence, given what we know about the imperfections of the justice system. And then analysis, why the state was constituted to protect people and their rights. So we're taking that previous claim that the state should never be willing to countenance the killing of innocent people. And we're maybe explaining a bit more why that's the case, because we have a conception of the state, so the state is there for everyone, and it should be trying to serve everyone's interests. It's not doing that, presumably, if it's killing them. So, as we see in the above example, you can actually have multiple independent, mutually supporting chains of analytical reasoning in favour of a single argument. I mean, this shouldn't be so surprising. This mirrors broadly how natural argumentation and persuasion works. You wouldn't really expect people just go along always having just a single chain of reasoning for any given argument. In competitive debate, this is also strategically or tactically useful as well, insofar as if you have multiple different reasons in favour of an argument, then it means that they're likely to be able to provide independent support for the same claim. So your opponents, by refuting one of your supporting reasons, haven't necessarily refuted the overall claim that you're trying to prove. They've just defeated one of your reasons for it. If you have multiple reasons, they have to defeat them all or provide reasons why the overall claim is false in and of itself. If we imagine this as an image of how this might look, you see a picture on the screen. So we have our overall title, which applies to the argument as a whole, but we also have three different strands of argumentation, which are broken down into different subpoints of analysis. One of them has statistics, presumably some analytical description of those statistics. Another has an example and some analytical explanation of the example and why it's significant or why it should be persuasive. And arguments 1 and 2 tend towards the same impact, right? So they tie into the same impact claim. Presumably, if this was a debate, these would be then independent chains of reasoning to get me to that impact. So in other words, if I lose argument 2, if my opponents refute it, I still have argument 1 as a means of explaining why it is that I'm able to claim that impact is true of my case. How do we actually go about dividing things into different chains of reasoning? What should be a separate chain? It really depends on whether what you're offering is an independent reason why something is true or important or not. If the reasons are independent from each other, treat them as if they were a separate chain. It's easier for you to follow if you deal with one chain at a time. You can transition between different chains of supporting analysis by saying things like, and another reason why this is true. So think about those transition statements as going from different reasons why something is true in terms of trying to prove those overall claims that you've given as the title of the thing you're setting out to prove. For example, suppose we wish to argue that abolishing private schools would increase the quality of teaching in state schools. That is our title or claim. So that's how we introduce our argument to the audience. We might have completely different reasons as to why this might be the case. So reason 1, for example, might be a lot of talented teachers are currently poached by private schools who have deeper pockets, are able to pay them higher wages. Reason 2, teachers are demotivated by the inequality in the profession and the fact that some of the most talented students are lost to private schools for scholarship. Reason 3, middle-class parents who often have more spare time to participate in parent-teacher associations will push teachers for higher standards. Now, you needn't think that they're particularly persuasive reasons, right? You might think that the first is maybe persuasive and the other two aren't. The point is, these are all independent reasons. So if I was engaged in this debate against an opponent, they would probably have to tackle all 3 of these reasons as opposed to just tackling the one. If they left some of those reasons intact, you might think the overall argument still stands, and I've shown how abolishing private schools would raise standards within the teaching profession. So we'll discuss evidence much more in a later workshop, and thinking about different standards of evidence, different kind of sources for evidence we might use, thinking about things like statistics. So we won't discuss it much here. We'll just note a couple of things. The first is that evidence needs to be interpreted. You need to explain why it is significant and persuasive. The same fact could be explained by multiple different reasons or multiple different explanations, and some of those could fall on one side of the debate and some on the other. So why does this evidence that you're offering into the debate prove your point? Why is it relevant to your side? That's why we need to analyse the evidence that we put into the debate. Now, notice, and this is why I'm cautiously including the term warrant here, evidence doesn't have to be statistics. Now, if you find that counterintuitive, then maybe substitute the term warrant here, which is something that's quite common amongst American debaters for thinking about the same concept. It can be anecdotes, it can be appeals to the audience's intuitions about a case. These are all things that I can point to as things which might ground a claim, that might be persuasive to judges or persuasive to the audience, as it were. They have a piece of evidence in their own experience of the world when they think about maybe an example or an anecdote I'm giving them. Now, you might recoil at this and think, well, that's not very good sound scientific evidence. Well, this is precisely why maybe we should be a bit cautious about using the term evidence. These are all reasons that a person would be persuaded by a thing. It doesn't need to be the case that we're operating in terms of the standards that we would want in a scientific journal. These are all things that humans use to persuade other humans to believe certain things, even if they are not the perfect form of evidence. They can be a style of evidence, and we can think of evidence as being reasonably persuasive, even when there might be better forms of evidence that if we knew, we could reach to and use. The final thing, or I guess the second final thing, that we're talking about is impacting arguments. So having persuasively argued for our title, conclusion, thesis statement, the thing that we're trying to prove, we should now explain the significance of that point. This tells the audience what the stakes are. We can call this the impact of the argument. Now, impact could mean impact in the world, or it could mean impact within the debate. So, for example, we could say, calling back our previous example of abolishing private schools, this will lead to more children being educated to a higher standard, which is crucially important in today's competitive international economy. And this tells us what the stakes are, why it is that the government or the public at large should care about the fact that we're raising standards in schools. Or we could say, imagining an alternative debate, this completely defeats the argument about the need to bail out the American auto industry that was made on the other side. Now, that is an impact, but it's a, as it were, debate impact. It explains to the audience, to the judges, what the significance of this argument in terms of the overall debate is. Now, these are both things we might think of as being an impact of the argument. It's the reason why we're saying the argument. It's the thing that they should take away is why the argument is overall important, or what significance it has in the overall debate. So, different ways maybe of breaking that down. We can think about impacts in terms of practical consequences of the arguments that we're making. So, we'll first think of this in terms of harms and benefits. So, benefits might be, say, good things that this does to certain people or institutions. Harms might be bad things that it does to certain people or institutions. Notice that these do need to be assessed relative to the individual that we're harming or benefiting. We might think that if we're harming a dictator, that might be a good thing. Alternatively, if we're benefiting a dictator, that might be a bad thing. So it does depend on the kind of person we're talking about, and it should therefore probably be accompanied by some explanation as to why it is that the audience and the judges should care about the kind of people that you are benefiting. Maybe they're particularly vulnerable individuals, maybe they're people who haven't necessarily had the same access to opportunities that other people have. These might be persuasive reasons why a certain group of individuals being benefited is more significant than it would be otherwise. We can also break benefits down between things that are intrinsic to a policy that we're trying to advance, or extrinsic to it. An intrinsic benefit is someone that flows directly from the policy inherently. So it's something that's just contained in the very fact that we're doing the policy. Whereas an extrinsic benefit is something that results from the policy, but is not really its primary goal. It might still be more important. So if we think about this House would legalise marijuana, the intrinsic benefit is that marijuana becomes legal and anyone who wants to can buy it, right? That's just literally what to legalise marijuana means. And this is obviously a benefit if you're someone that was previously disadvantaged by the fact that you couldn't legally smoke it, other things being equal. The extrinsic benefit might be something like the fact that if it is taxed, it will bring a lot of revenue into the government. So this is definitely a benefit, at least relative to the government, but it's not really the core of the policy. But nonetheless, it should be weighed, and it's the kind of thing that you want to be looking out for when you're thinking about policies and saying, okay, this is a benefit which is direct, but there might be secondary benefits as well. Other effects of doing the policy that might be things that we should think about and might be things that we should weigh. We can similarly think of this in terms of primary and secondary impact. So a primary impact would be something that's the immediate consequence of the claim that you're making, whereas a secondary impact would be a consequence of that consequence. Let me give you an example. So we could say, as a result of some policy, that people will be very angry. Okay? That's an impact. But that's maybe not a very significant impact. People are angered by policies all the time. But because they are very angry, this will change how they vote in the future, harming political capital for other important policies. Now, this is a secondary impact because it's a consequence of the fact that we've made them angry. What are they going to do with that anger? Well, they're going to change the way they vote, and that might be significant for us in the future. Say we're wanting to do other policies along similar lines, or things that are maybe more important in terms of dealing with whatever social problem we were trying to engage with. So secondary impacts can actually sometimes be more important than the primary impact. Always explore what the effects of the effect are. Don't necessarily stop just at the first effect of your policy. Maybe consider what the effects of that effect are. Thinking about the ways to try and get deeper into the debate, deeper into the kind of consequences that you're talking about. Maybe don't try and string too many long chains of impact together though. No one will believe that a change in schools policy will result in World War III. So by the time you're at the effects of an effect of an effect, you're probably a bit far from what you should be talking about. Last thing we're going to discuss is linkage. So it's important that your arguments relate back to the motion in order to be relevant. So probably best if you frequently in the course of trying to explain your argument, do that link back yourself. Explain why it is you're saying the things that you're saying to people, why it is that you're making the argument you're making. It helps insulate you from accusations that you've failed to show that relevance. Always be asking yourself what the relevance of an argument is. One option might be to use rhetorical questions. Just make your audience complicit in your reasoning process and say, why am I telling you this? Or what is the significance of this for the argument? But it should definitely be something that's accompanied maybe at the end of your impact statement. So it makes sense to say, well look, here is why this is so important in the context of debate. That degree of explanation of comparatively the importance of one argument relative to another. So if you look to your handouts, we have a number of worked examples just to split up the group into maybe pairs in order to apply some of the things that we've thought about in this workshop. So the examples I have here, this has legalized drugs, this has to make voting compulsory, this has support tuition fees. In each of these, we've outlined an argument that someone would probably want to make if they were in proposition in these debates. And then we're asking you to ask the debate club to then come up with a title for these arguments, come up with the major pieces of analysis, maybe splitting them up into different strands, chains of analysis. What are the major examples or evidence they could cite to support their arguments, and what the impact of whatever the argument that we're suggesting is. So in the case of drugs, undercutting the black market. In the case of making voting compulsory, the idea of making sure that we know what it is that everyone wants by making sure that they vote. In the case of tuition fees, what the benefit is in terms of the idea that people are the primary beneficiaries of the education should pay rather than the general taxpayer. So if you look at the handouts now, I think that says the supporting explanation for how this exercise plays out. Thanks very much.